Thank you. So I'd like to again welcome everyone for joining us, and we're going to begin a discussion on the budget. We have some pass outs. One is an outline from the budget from the House Budget Committee, and the other the charts that we're about to discuss right now. I think everyone knows that we started with a huge deficit and a bad economy, but what we like to do is discuss using the charts about where we are in the budget before we start talking about what we're trying to do about it. This chart shows the budget deficit over the last almost 30 or last 20 years. First, it's divided by presidential administration. You'll notice that during the 1990s, we made some tough decisions. We balanced the budget, went into surplus, and in fact, it was so controversial that a lot of the Democrats that passed the budget in 1993, about 50 of them lost their seats. Between the budget vote and I guess gun control might have had something to do with it too, but it was a very 1994 election that occurred after the 93 budget was very controversial. One of the things that happened is when you get to 2001, you show a huge surplus. We had a projected surplus at that time of $5.5 trillion. $5.5 trillion. That is was enough to pay off the entire debt held by the public. When Greenspan was testifying before Congress in 2001, the questions he had to answer were questions like, what will happen if we pay off the national debt? What will happen to interest rates? What will happen to investment policy if you don't have government bonds? What will happen to the bond market if you don't have government bonds? All these are the kind of questions he was having to deal with. We passed a budget in 2001, and that was the last time you heard about paying off the national debt. Instead of a $5.5 trillion surplus, and remember that number because we're going to come back to it in a couple of charts, $5.5 trillion surplus, we're going to end up in those 10 years with a deficit of probably $3 or possibly $4 trillion, a swing of almost $9 trillion over an 8-year period, which is $1 trillion a year. The debt held by the public, the little blue lines there shows that it was going down to zero. Debt held by the public has exploded. It's about $9 trillion. There's a interesting this is debt held in foreign countries. The black line obviously shows we're going down to zero, so there'd be zero debt held by foreign countries. Now that's really going off the chart. This chart has national security implications, foreign policy implications, because much of the debt is held by Japan, China, and Saudi Arabia. Obviously, you are hard-pressed to negotiate gasoline prices or gas oil prices if you're borrowing money from the people you're negotiating with. It's kind of hard to do a tough trade deal if you if you got to start, can you borrow? Can you lend me some money? And so between China, Japan, and Saudi Arabia, this chart has significant implications. This chart is the budget spending and revenues as a percentage of GDP. The red line is revenues, blue line is spending, and you'll see since 1975 we were always spending more than we were bringing in. During the 90s, we corrected that for a couple of years, and you'll see that the red line, revenues, actually went above the spending, and we were headed in a fairly favorable direction. Unfortunately, in 2001, we passed a budget that not only collapsed revenues, but it also increased spending. One thing to note is that this year the spending has gotten totally out of control. We had a huge deficit. The revenues have collapsed and the spending has gone out of control. One thing to consider, though, is that if you have one bad year, that's not a big deal. What is a big deal is your institutionalized, kind of embedded budget as you go out. Because you'll see in a couple of years we're able to get that back under reasonable control, where it's about a 3% deficit as a percentage of GDP. And that goes out fairly, it continues to go out as far as the eye can see. Now, I'll be the first to say that a 3% GDP deficit is not where we need to be, but from where we are now, to get it that close means that we've got it down to 3% deficit, and we've got to do better than that in the future. We'll have more decisions to make. If we can get this budget passed and get that much of the problem solved, okay, but we've got more work to do. We got into this situation. We got into the situation because of, as it's indicated, revenues collapsed. That was caused by tax cuts that were primarily weighted to the wealthy. Some people hate it when you say that, so you just put up the chart and you can see where the income, what different income ranges got out of the tax cut. If you're over $1 million, you're almost off the chart. If you're under $50,000, you don't need any ink to draw the bar. So the chart here is a $20 billion tax cut called PEP and Ps. Involves personal exemption phase-out and another tax named after former Representative Pease. But this just shows how that $20 billion was distributed. If you make over $1 million a year, you got about $17,000 out of that. $200,000 to $1 million, you got about $650. And under that, $100,000 to $200,000, about $1 a month. And under $100,000, on average, zero. So when they say that's where the tax cuts went. Now, they also say we did that to create jobs. We didn't create any jobs in the last 8 years. If you look at the chart, you'll notice that we had the worst job performance since the Great Depression. We didn't stimulate the economy. This is the Dow Jones Industrial Average through every administration, about 8 years each or every administration back to the Great Depression, and you'll notice that we had the worst Dow performance in the last 8 years since the Great Depression. Now, this next chart is kind of complicated, but I had to develop the chart because we kept hearing that we cut taxes and actually increased revenues. Well, to break down the color code, green is a year in which the individual income taxes set a brand new record. Red is a year in which they did not break a brand new record. And you'll notice since 1960, and the chart is the same going back to the 1930s when they started with individual income tax, good policies, bad policies, good years, bad years, recessions, good economic times, tax cuts, tax increases, every year but two since 1960, you set a new record. So saying you set a new record, revenues isn't saying very much. But just to put a little truth to it, in fact, the revenues, in fact, did not increase, they decreased, and it was 6 years before you set a new record. That has not happened since they had the individual income tax starting in the 1930s. You've never gone more than 2 years without setting a brand new record. So when they say we increased revenues, that's just simply not true. Now, all of this, I think the compelling reason that we need to get the budget under control is this chart right here. It's the Social Security cash flow. Fact is that we could probably get along pretty good with a couple of percent deficit. You know, everybody carries a little debt, credit card, car payment and everything. You can get along okay with a lot of debt. And if we didn't have this chart to deal with, we wouldn't have much of a problem. Unfortunately, the Social Security cash flow and the little blue bars show that we are actually bringing in more in Social Security than we're paying out. We're stashing it because when people my age start retiring this year and years to come, we all of a sudden have a huge deficit and growing deficit. When you cross the first line, that's $200 billion, $400 billion, you're down almost $1 trillion in the foreseeable future in deficits in Social Security. Now, in 2000, we've been setting aside in a illusory trust fund money, extra money we're paying in. By 2043, that money's gone. And we're having to deal with this cash flow on an annual basis. Obviously, if we haven't built up enough surplus to cover that, we've got to consider what to do about Social Security. Now, the total present value of the shortfall for 75 years is $4 trillion. I told you we're going to come back to that number, $5.5 trillion. We had that in surplus 8 years ago. We spent it, instead of setting it aside for Social Security and having some left over to make sure Social Security was good for 75 years, it's gone. So we're going to have to start all over trying to figure out what we can do to deal with this chart. And to put it in long-term perspective, this chart shows that if we continue taxing at the rate we're taxing now, where we'll be in just a couple of decades. By 2040, this chart shows that we'll be able to pay the blue, which is interest on the national debt, the green, which is Social Security, and then we'll have to start borrowing money to pay for Medicare and Medicaid, and the yellow, which is all other government spending. There are a couple of challenges, specific challenges that make our life difficult, and one is that healthcare costs are increasing at a rate significantly higher than inflation. That is not a budget situation. It affects everybody. You ask small business people what's happened with the biggest cost. It's healthcare. So not only is Medicare and Medicaid a problem for the government, healthcare is a problem for everybody. So we have to get it under control. But this is where we are today and why we need to be doing something about the budget. We're also, unfortunately, now dealing with the fact that we're in still in a recession. Since the recession began in December 2007, we've lost over 5 million jobs, with most of those jobs occurring in the last few months. So we can't just sit back and idly doing nothing, because you notice in one of those charts where the revenues collapsed along with the recession. So we've got to get the economy back on track, and as a result, we passed the Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which invested $787 billion into our economy to get it back jump-started. Funds are already making their way into the governments. The Virginia Department of Transportation will be rolling out its final list of transportation projects that will be funded by that act. Federal agencies are also beginning to announce solicitations for competitive grants that will receive additional funding. Tax cuts for moderate and low and moderate income individuals, $400 for individuals, $800 for married couples, went into effect at the beginning of April. Recovery payments of $250 will go out next month to Social Security recipients and our veterans. The Recovery Act is just one component of what needs to be done. As I said, one bad year isn't much of a problem, but you got to get the budget under control. The House passed one budget resolution. The Senate passed a slightly different budget resolution. We'll have to get those coordinated when we come back next week. but it is one of the most important documents that passes Congress every year. It sets the framework. It only sets the framework, but it's an important framework for our spending in the upcoming year. The federal government is expected to spend $3.5 trillion, which includes Medicare, Social Security, defense, veterans, and all other spending. A substantial portion of that spending is what's called mandatory spending, which means it goes on year after year, whether Congress does anything or not. Medicaid, for example, and Medicare are mandatory, Social Security are mandatory spending programs. We don't have to do anything year after year. Those programs will continue to get funded. All other spending is what's called discretionary spending. That includes defense, but it includes everything else that's not on kind of automatic pilot. We do that in appropriations bills, and if we don't pass those bills, either we have to pass a continuing resolution or agencies just don't get funded. The House resolution mirrors the same priorities outlined in President Obama's budget request that he submitted in February. It focuses new funding on education, healthcare reform, science and technology, transportation and infrastructure, and clean, renewable energy. And it provides a clear path to getting us back on track to fiscal responsibility. The House resolution includes $100 billion in education funding that is in the Recovery Act. It adopts some of the President's requests and adopts the President's request by increasing funding for the Department of Education by $5 billion for fiscal year 2010. These additional investments will help students, parents, and teachers ensure that everyone can get not only a quality education, but also access to college. The House Budget Resolution also budgets for health care reform by setting aside a deficit-neutral reserve for health care reform. He's got a lot of health care reform initiatives, but they can only go into effect if we pay for them. There are currently 46 million uninsured Americans, and many of these Americans would have health insurance if we can get the costs controlled. But we have to also, a lot of people are unable to afford health care even at a reasonable cost. We've covered almost all children so far. There are only about 5 million children in America not covered, and frankly, it doesn't cost that much to get to those, but most of those could afford the coverage if they went ahead and paid for it. So I think we've gotten everybody that needs help. There are a few more that I think we need to just cover and get covered anyway. Analysts estimate by lowering healthcare costs and expanding access and eliminating what's called cost shifting, those without health insurance going to the hospital, those with health insurance have to pay a little bit more to cover them. So we need, if everybody's covered, that would eliminate all of the cost sharing. So a lot of the costs for health care we're all actually providing already. We just need to do it in a much more sensible way. The House resolution, we're proud to say, honors our veterans by providing an 11% increase over veterans' health care and services. Funding will help the Department of Veterans Affairs address the increase in veterans from the Afghanistan and Iraqi war by reducing case backlogs and providing better services. We'll also help renovate the veterans hospitals and veterans centers across the nation. The budget resolution also invests more in science, technology, and transportation and infrastructure. The House budget also restores a budget rule that we call PAYGO that helped us during the 1990s. PAYGO is a simple concept. If you increase spending, you have to pay for it. If you have a new program, either you pay for it with cash or you cut somebody else's program, but the program has to be paid for. If you want to cut taxes, either you cut spending, concurrently cut spending, or you raise somebody else's taxes. PAYGO, one of the things that PAYGO does is it locks in the spending, and so natural growth will get you out of the budget. But you have to lock down spending, and that's what PAYGO does. You can't spend any more than you've been spending in the past without paying for it dollar for dollar. This budget resolution restores statutory pay-go as a budget rule. That will make sure that we get spending under control. House budget resolution makes the tough choices to continue our economic recovery. It does not increase taxes for any American earning less than $250,000 a year, and starts off by cutting the deficit in half from what we started with this year, about 2014. The next task will not be easy. This president has inherited the biggest deficit that anyone has inherited in the history of the United States, and we have to be responsible and just deal with it. In Washington, one of the challenges we're dealing with is there are essentially two competing economic theories. One, the theory that worked in the 1990s, where we clamped down on spending with pay-go. We had the taxes were increased slightly for upper income individuals and reduced for lower income individuals. We invested in jobs, and as a result of that economic theory, we had record job growth. We had record gains in the Dow. Median income went up $7,000. The number of people in poverty went down, and we eliminated the deficit and created a surplus sufficient to pay off on track to paying off the national debt. That's one theory. The other theory started in 2001, where we had significant tax cuts mostly for the wealthy, increased spending, and went immediately into deficit. The median income for Americans actually went down when adjusted for inflation. The Dow Jones Industrial Average and the job growth both worse since the Great Depression. And we have two different theories. Both have been tried in the last 16 years. What we are trying to do, quite frankly, is go back to the blue and get out of the red.